Epictetus was a slave. He owned nothing, controlled nothing, not his body, not his labor, not his daily circumstances. And yet the philosophical system he built inside those conditions became one of the most precise and durable frameworks for human endurance ever recorded. That is not an accident, and it is not a metaphor. It is a direct consequence of what Stoicism actually is. If you are living through difficulty right now, professional, personal, internal, the habits explored in this video are not comfort. They are a method. They were developed under conditions most of us will never face, and they survived not because they were poetic but because they worked. In this video, we will examine 6 specific Stoic habits drawn from the Discourses of Epictetus, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and the letters of Seneca, and what each habit demands of the person willing to practice it. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Before we examine these habits individually, it is worth holding one foundational idea: the Stoics were not interested in making hard times feel better. They were interested in making the person who faces hard times harder, more deliberate, more precise, more genuinely free. That distinction will run through everything that follows. The first Stoic habit, and the one from which all others derive their logic, is the disciplined separation of what is within our power from what is not. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion, composed around 125 AD, with exactly this division, stating that some things are up to us and some things are not, and that the entirety of human misery flows from confusing the two categories. This is not a casual observation. It is the structural foundation on which every subsequent Stoic practice rests, which means that without this habit, the others have no ground to stand on. What belongs to the first category, what is genuinely ours, is, for Epictetus, remarkably narrow: our judgments, our intentions, our desires, and our responses. Everything outside that boundary, health, reputation, the behavior of others, the outcomes of our efforts, belongs to the second category, and the Stoics were ruthlessly honest about this. To treat an external outcome as though it were within our control is not ambition, they argued. It is a category error, and it is the category error that produces anxiety, resentment, and what Marcus Aurelius in Meditations 4.3 calls the self-inflicted wound of giving the external world permission to disturb the internal one. The practical implication of this habit is demanding precisely because it requires a kind of constant audit. In every difficult moment, the Stoic practitioner asks not what can I fix but what, in this situation, actually belongs to me. That question does not eliminate grief or frustration, but it concentrates energy where it can actually produce something, and it withdraws energy from the vast theater of circumstances over which no individual has final authority. What Epictetus said next, however, complicates what most people assume this distinction is asking of them, because it is not asking for passivity. It is asking for something considerably more difficult. The second Stoic habit follows directly from the first, and it is the one that operates at the most intimate level of consciousness, the discipline of assent, or what Epictetus in the Discourses 1.1 calls the capacity to withhold agreement from an impression before allowing it to become a judgment. The Stoics understood that between an event and our response to that event, there exists a moment, sometimes vanishingly brief, in which the mind either accepts an interpretation of what has happened or examines it. That moment is where Stoic practice lives. Marcus Aurelius returns to this habit with striking frequency throughout the Meditations, because he recognized how easily the mind attaches catastrophic meaning to ordinary adversity. In Meditations 8.7, He writes that we should remove the judgment and the complaint is gone, by which he does not mean that the difficulty ceases to exist but that the suffering attached to it is not intrinsic to the event, it is imported by the story the mind constructs around it. This is why the Stoics described incorrect assent not as weakness but as a philosophical error, one that can be identified and corrected through sustained attention. The habit, in practice, demands something that feels counterintuitive in hard times, it demands slowness. Not the slowness of inaction, but the slowness of deliberate interpretation, the willingness to ask, before accepting the mind's first account of what a setback means, whether that account is actually true, whether it is necessary, and whether it is serving anything beyond the consolidation of despair. Seneca describes this discipline in Letter 5 of the Epistulae Moralis as the practice of distinguishing between the fact and the weight we place upon it, a distinction he considered among the most liberating a person could internalize. But this raises a harder question, one that the Stoics were not willing to leave theoretical. If the discipline of assent is a habit of mind, what does it require from the body and from daily practice to make it stable enough to hold under genuine pressure? The third and fourth Stoic habits belong together because they share a single underlying logic, the deliberate introduction of difficulty before difficulty is imposed. Seneca describes this practice explicitly in Letter 18 of the Epistulae Moralis, written around 65 AD, advising Lucilius to set aside several days at regular intervals in which he would eat the plainest food, wear the simplest clothing, and ask himself whether this is actually what he had feared. The purpose is not asceticism for its own sake. It is inoculation, a controlled exposure to the conditions of loss, so that when loss arrives uninvited, it finds a mind that has already stood there and knows the ground. This habit is paired in Stoic practice with what the Romans called Memento mori, the active, deliberate contemplation of mortality and impermanence. Marcus Aurelius engages in this practice throughout the Meditations not as a morbid exercise but as what he understood to be a corrective to the distortions that comfort produces. In Meditations 9.3, he reflects on the great emperors and philosophers of the past, men of enormous power and intellect, and notes that they are gone entirely, which means that attachment to any external condition, including favorable ones, is a kind of philosophical debt that will eventually be called in. The practice of remembering this regularly is not pessimism. It is, for the Stoics, the precondition of genuine gratitude. Taken together, these two habits, voluntary exposure to hardship and the regular contemplation of impermanence, serve the same function. They prevent the psyche from building its stability on circumstances that are, by nature, temporary. A person who has practiced discomfort deliberately does not collapse at its arrival. A person who has meditated on loss does not find its eventual appearance entirely alien. The Stoics were, in this sense, not philosophers of endurance after the fact. They were engineers of resilience before the fact, and the training was the practice. Yet there is a dimension of Stoic hardship that this internal training alone cannot address, one that points, surprisingly, toward other people, and toward a habit that the popular image of Stoicism most consistently misunderstands. The fifth Stoic habit directly contradicts the popular image of the philosopher as a solitary, emotionally sealed figure. It is the active cultivation of a community oriented toward virtue. Epictetus in the Discourses 2.22 argues that human beings are by nature social animals and that the Stoic project is not withdrawal from others but the transformation of how one relates to them, moving from relationships built on need, utility, or distraction toward what he calls fellowship in reason, the shared commitment to living examined lives. Marcus Aurelius echoes this in Meditations 6.7, reminding himself that he was born for others and that the impulse toward isolation under pressure is one of the mind's more sophisticated forms of evasion. The sixth and final habit is perhaps the most demanding, because it requires not merely the acceptance of what is difficult but what Marcus Aurelius, drawing on an idea Epictetus attributes to Zeus in the Discourses 2.17, approaches as amor fati, the love of fate. This is not passive resignation dressed in philosophical language. It is the active orientation of the will toward what is, rather than toward the fantasy of what one wishes were the case, which means it requires the practitioner to find, in the actual texture of their circumstances, including the painful ones, the precise material with which virtue can be exercised. Seneca captures this in Letter 96 when he writes that the good man wrestles with misfortune and that hardship is the training ground on which character either proves itself or reveals that it was always only comfort in disguise. What these 6 habits form, taken together, is not a list of techniques. They form an architecture, a coherent and internally consistent structure for how a human being can inhabit difficulty without being defined by it. The dichotomy of control establishes what belongs to the self. The discipline of assent governs what the self says about what happens to it. Voluntary hardship and memento mori harden the self before crisis arrives. Community in virtue prevents the self from collapsing inward. And amor fati reorients the self's relationship to necessity itself, transforming what cannot be changed from an obstacle into the very ground of practice. The practically applicable implication of all of this is precise. Stoic endurance is not a temperament you either have or lack. It is a set of habits that must be practiced daily, in conditions of relative comfort, so that when genuine adversity arrives, the architecture is already standing. What the Stoics understood, with a clarity that 2,000 years have not diminished, is that hardship is not the exception to a human life, it is one of its constitutive features, and the only question that philosophy can honestly address is what kind of person you intend to be when it arrives. These 6 habits, the dichotomy of control, the discipline of assent, voluntary hardship, the contemplation of mortality, community in virtue, and the active embrace of necessity, are not 6 separate ideas. They are 6 expressions of a single commitment, to live deliberately, rather than reactively, in every condition that existence places before you. The person who practices them does not become invulnerable. They become something more valuable than that, they become genuinely free. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe and we will keep exploring why.